You mentioned a moment ago the role of the tech in implementing the G20 statements about protectionism is a good kind of segue to start into talking about the state of the economy as we see it now. But I noticed in the G20 statement in Pittsburgh, they devoted exactly 4 words to protectionism. We will fight protectionism. In the April meeting, they have a whole section devoted to the issue of protectionism. Does this concern you that we might be backsliding a bit, or really not giving the attention, or has it turned out it's not the problem we thought it might be?
No, I think it's a growing problem, and I believe that's why we actually have more words devoted to it and more high-level recognition of this issue. And what's driving it is just simply the slowdown in the economic activity. And so there's a great tendency, and we even saw it in the U.S., for the Buy America provision to be built into the stimulus bill. That was a big mistake in my view. And we then see that get repeated in China. But those kinds of protectionist approaches and thinking actually impair economic growth and job creation in my view. And thus, having our G20 leaders highlight that issue and then trying to continue to carry that through all levels of government is exactly what we should do.
The test is going to be whether they actually do carry it through.
And that's the challenge, because as you know, as a former elected official, when you're home in your district and someone is interested in how are you going to protect our jobs here, you're quite tempted to draft in some protectionist kinds of language into bills that you might be associated with. And we need to be able to call those things out.
Perhaps taking a little bit of your TAB hat off and maybe putting on your Deloitte hat just a little bit more with a broader economic view. How do you see the state of the economy today? Where do you think it's going? And are people talk about that we're coming out of the slump, that we're out of the recession, that we're moving forward? You think that's true, or what kind of a future do you see for us in the next few months?
Well, I think there are definitely very tangible signs of recovery. I think the most objective of those are the credit spreads. And we know when the economic activity, was slowing down dramatically, the spreads were very wide. And so now to see spreads returning to their historic level is a very positive sign. I'm hopeful that we are seeing the economy bottom out as we move through this final quarter of 2009. I hope we find our bottom in 2009 and we can begin a sustained recovery in 2010. That's the optimistic view. There are some who believe 2010 also is going to be very difficult. What will make me an optimist is when we can start to see job creation and start to see growth in those employment numbers. I will move from describing the future state of the economy with the word hope, and I will add to it a sense of optimism when we get to job creation.
At the moment, we're still seeing unemployment, of course, rising. So is that just a lagging indicator at this point, or?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a lagging indicator. And one of the realities is each of us, including me and my business, I've got some unused capacity, and I can have some growth in my revenue without needing to add large numbers of new hires. And I know that that's true in many, many businesses, just simply the factory utilization rates and the capacity that we've built into the system. We will first take advantage of putting to work our current productive capacity before we start adding to our payrolls.
Did we, in this economic downturn, though, do some things, fundamentally, did businesses do some things to make themselves more competitive that over the long run means they're not going to be adding jobs back in as quickly as you might have seen in another consumer-led kind of a recession?
Now, there's no question that business is more competitive today, and some of the actions that were taken through the crisis, in fact, reduced cost structures, and businesses were compelled to reduce their break-even point and continue to optimize earnings and optimize cash flow. And now, the way the business models have been built, you can actually have some growth without needing to add to those payrolls just because of the capacity in the system. But we are more competitive. We didn't waste the crisis in terms of making our business enterprises more competitive.
So it would be safe to say then that you do see that this crisis may have had a long-lasting effect on the way that business operates, that we do business, and perhaps on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yes, our enterprises, our business enterprises in Europe and the U.S. are more competitive than they were before this crisis began, able to compete with the Asian competitors.
Mm-hmm. Well, perhaps a final question or two. Coming back to the G20, how do you see the G20 leaders interacting with leaders of other parts of the world, China, India, Japan, Brazil, major countries like that? They're part of the G20, of course, but perhaps I should be saying the European and U.S. leaders. What kind of a relationship should we be seeking with these other major growing economic powers?
I think a constructive engagement is essential, and I'm supportive of the declaration that has been put in place and the public statements made that we need to move with respect to global economic issues to look to the G20 as the body for policy and solution rather than to a G7. I believe our economy is just simply diversified to the point where the G20 is a much more relevant body than the smaller G7 that we've worked with in the past.
Well, following that through to trade, do you believe that completing the Doha round is absolutely essential?
Absolutely essential. We've got to commit to go to work on and try to make meaningful progress in that Doha round. And if we can't get that done, and I hope we can, but if we can't get that done, we need to continue to move forward with bilateral trade agreements and lead in that fashion. But trade is going to be one of the elements of a sustained recovery.
Would it be only bilateral trade, or would it be something that would be U.S., European?
Oh, sure.
Marketplace?
Yeah, I was using Europe as a group with the EU, but I'm happy with the multilateral view of Europe as well, because there certainly are important trading partners in each of those markets. I'd just make two other points. One is I believe that what we need in these markets in order to get markets moving is we need to have trust and confidence. And one of the vehicles for confidence is effective regulation. And so there's going to be a meaningful effort underway to actually look at the regulatory regime, certainly for financial institutions, and I think more broadly. And I think that's essential for confidence. But then I would also emphasize that I believe these are global markets, and so what I'm hopeful is that we can create a meaningful framework for global regulation and then have national regulation live comfortably within that global regulation. In order for a regulator to be effective, they have to have enforcement authority, and any regulator to obtain enforcement authority, that must be bestowed upon them by a national government. And so regulation will therefore always be national. But I think it's going to be very important as we come out of this crisis that national regulation be aligned with a global framework that can be created. Because otherwise, we end up with the politics of the lowest common denominator and participants in the economy engaging in the art of regulatory arbitrage that I think is not healthy or helpful.
Well, you've laid down an enormous challenge for U.S. and European leaders, as well as for an organization such as the one you head, the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, to play a role in bringing about that regulatory framework that is a rational one, and one that businesses on both sides of the Atlantic can operate in. And we wish you well. We really hope that you're successful at doing this, and that the European and U.S. leaders will come to understand the kinds of ideas and promotions that have been made by the Transatlantic Business Dialogue to bring this about. We thank you very much for joining us today. I've been talking today with Jim Quigley, who is the CEO of Deloitte Touche Tohmatsu and also the co-chair of the Transatlantic Business Dialogue. Thank you for joining us on this videocast and podcast.